The chandeliers of Lady Ashworth's ballroom cast their honeyed light across the assembled splendor of London society, each crystalline pendant trembling with the movement of 300 guests whose silks and satins whispered secrets into the perfumed air of this April evening in 1818. Rosalind Pemberton stood near the edge of the dancing, her gloved hands clasped before her with attention. She prayed appeared as mere anticipation rather than the nauseating anxiety that twisted through her 17-year-old heart like a tightening cord. This was her debut season, her entrance into a world she had been prepared for since childhood, yet felt entirely unready to navigate, and every eye seemed to catalogue her inadequacies, the way her curls refused to maintain their arrangement, despite her maid's ministrations, the slight tremor in her smile when gentlemen approached, the unfortunate tendency of her wit to fail her precisely when she most required it. She had danced twice, once with her cousin and once with Lord Pembridge's second son, who had trodden upon her hem, and now she waited in that peculiar agony of hope and dread that marked every young woman's first venture into the marriage market. Across the ballroom, elevated by consequence and temperament above the General Assembly, stood Nicholas Ashcroft, the Duke of Winterbourne, 25 years of age, and possessed of a fortune, title, and countenance that rendered him the season's most sought-after prize, despite, or perhaps because, of the glacial remoteness that characterized his every interaction. He observed the debutantes with an expression of such studied indifference that it bordered on disdain, his dark eyes passing over eager faces and anxious smiles with the dispassion of one examining livestock at market. Rosalind had noticed him immediately upon entering, had felt the peculiar flutter that his presence induced, had caught herself watching the severe line of his jaw and wondering what might soften that austere mouth into something approaching warmth. She had entertained, for precisely 3 minutes, the dangerous fancy that when their eyes met across the ballroom floor, there had been something recognition, interest, the invisible thread of connection her novels promised before reason reasserted itself, and she dismissed such thoughts as the foolishness of an overwrought imagination. Therefore, when her father approached the Duke with unmistakable purpose, threading through the crowd with the determined stride of a man about to negotiate a business arrangement of personal significance, Rosalind felt her stomach plummet, even as a wild, irresponsible hope blazed briefly in her chest. She watched their conversation, her father's animated gestures and ingratiating smile, the Duke's perfect stillness, and then both men turned to look directly at her, and in that moment Rosalind understood that her life was about to change, though she could not yet comprehend the full measure of the transformation. Her father beckoned her forward. The crowd seemed to part with the inexorable quality of a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, as she moved toward them on legs that felt disconnected from her conscious will, her slippers whispering against the polished floor, her heart hammering against her stays with such violence she feared it might be audible. Her father's hand upon her elbow was meant to be steadying, but felt instead like a brand. "Your Grace," he said, his voice carrying that particular joviality that marked his most mercenary moods, "may I present my eldest daughter, Miss Rosalind Pemberton? I believe, as I have just indicated, that she would make an admirable match for a gentleman of your standing." The Duke's gaze settled upon her with the weight of a physical thing, and for 3 heartbeats Rosalind allowed herself to believe that the intensity she perceived therein was interest rather than assessment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearest guests with the clarity of a pronouncement from on high. "I find Miss Pemberton thoroughly unsuitable, lacking in grace, deficient in conversation, and entirely without the temperament required for a duchess. I would advise you to seek more appropriate ambitions for your daughter, sir." The words landed like blows, each syllable a small violence that reverberated through Rosalind's chest and stole the breath from her lungs. The ballroom, which moments before had been filled with music and laughter, seemed to contract around her. Every face turned toward the spectacle of her humiliation, every eye wide with shock or gleaming with the particular satisfaction that accompanies another's downfall. She stood frozen, her mind unable to process the enormity of what had just occurred, her body betraying her by remaining upright when she wished only to disappear into the floor. Somewhere distant she heard her father's sputtering attempts at response, heard the rising murmur of gossip beginning its inexorable spread, but these sounds reached her as if through water, muffled and strange. What she saw with terrible clarity was the Duke's face, still as marble and just as cold, his eyes already dismissing her as he turned away. And in that moment, something within Rosalind, some bright thing she had not known she possessed, until it shattered, broke cleanly into pieces. She managed to curtsy, though to whom or why she could not have said, managed to turn with a composure she did not feel, and walk rather than run toward the doors that led to the entrance hall, to escape to anywhere but here. Behind her the whispers rose like a tide. Her mother materialized at her side with the supernatural awareness that mortification summons, and together they navigated the gauntlet of pitying looks and barely concealed delight that lined their path to the exit. The carriage ride through London's rain-slicked streets was marked by a silence more devastating than any recrimination. Her mother's disappointment, a palpable presence in the darkness, her own tears falling with the same relentless rhythm as the drops that struck the carriage roof. Through the window, the city's lights blurred into streaks of gold and amber, beautiful and unreachable as every dream she had entertained about her future, about love, about becoming someone worthy of regard, thoroughly unsuitable. The words repeated themselves with the persistence of a curse, branding themselves into her memory where they would remain, she sensed, for all the years to come. She did not know, could not know, that in his study window many streets away, the Duke of Winterbourne stood watching the rain and seeing not the weather but her face, the devastation he had witnessed there, and that his hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white with the effort of maintaining the composure that was all he had ever known. The weeks that followed Lady Ashworth's ball stretched before Rosalind like a sentence to be endured rather than time to be lived, each day marked by the peculiar torture of knowing that her humiliation had become the season's most delectable morsel of gossip, passed from drawing-room to drawing-room with the speed and enthusiasm reserved for truly spectacular social disasters. She heard the whispers even when no one spoke, felt the weight of pitying glances and satisfied smirks whenever she forced herself to attend the few events her mother insisted could not be declined, and each encounter reinforced what the Duke's words had planted in her mind, that she was indeed lacking, deficient, fundamentally unsuitable, not merely for a duchess's coronet, but perhaps for any position in polite society at all. The girl who had entered that ballroom with nervous hope had been replaced by someone who moved through rooms like a ghost, present but not participating, smiling when required, but feeling nothing beyond a hollow ache that had taken up permanent residence in her chest. Her mother's disappointment manifested as a particular kind of silence, the absence of recrimination somehow more devastating than anger would have been, as though Rosalind's failure was so complete that words could not adequately address it. Her father retreated into his club and his business affairs, avoiding her eyes when they passed in hallways, and in this way Rosalind understood that she had become an embarrassment to be managed rather than a daughter to be cherished. Only Charlotte, her sister of 15 years with eyes that saw too much and a heart that felt too deeply, attempted to breach the walls Rosalind had begun constructing around herself, slipping into her room at night to hold her while she wept, whispering reassurances that meant nothing against the weight of public censure and private shame. I am graceless. Rosalind told herself in the mirror each morning, cataloguing her inadequacies with the thoroughness of one determined to accept an unpleasant truth. I am deficient in conversation, lacking in temperament, thoroughly unsuitable. The words became a litany, a prayer in reverse, each repetition driving the lesson deeper until she could no longer remember what confidence had felt like, what hope had tasted like before it turned to ash in her mouth. By the third week, she had ceased attending social functions entirely, pleading headaches that were not entirely fabricated, and her mother had stopped insisting, recognizing perhaps that Rosalind's presence did more harm than good to the family's prospects, that Charlotte's debut in 2 years would proceed more smoothly if the memory of this disaster had time to fade. It was Charlotte who suggested, with the careful diplomacy of one approaching a wounded animal, that perhaps a removal to the country estate in Somerset might provide respite, space to recover away from London's merciless scrutiny, and Rosalind seized upon this solution with desperate gratitude, already imagining the silence of rural life, the blessed absence of eyes that judged and tongues that whispered. Her parents agreed with an alacrity that confirmed her suspicions about their relief at her departure, and within a fortnight she found herself in a carriage bound for Somerset, watching London recede behind her with feelings too complicated to name shame and relief and grief, and something that might have been the first stirrings of anger beneath the suffocating weight of her humiliation. She did not know, could not see, that in his study overlooking Grosvenor Square, the Duke of Winterbourne stood at his window, watching her carriage disappear into the flow of London traffic, his expression unreadable even to himself, his hands clenched behind his back with a tension that suggested either extreme indifference or its opposite, and that he remained there long after she had gone, staring at nothing, thinking everything, and feeling something that might have been regret if he had allowed himself to name it. 3 years passed with the quiet inevitability of seasons turning, and when autumn arrived at the Somerset estate in 1821, it found Rosalind Pemberton transformed in ways that had nothing to do with the mere passage of time, and everything to do with the deliberate reconstruction of a self that had been shattered on a ballroom floor in London. She was 20 now, no longer the anxious girl who had fled the capital with shame burning in her chest, and the transformation showed itself not in her appearance, though she had grown into a beauty that combined grace with something harder, more self-possessed, but in the way she moved through the world with purpose rather than apology, with certainty rather than the desperate need for approval that had characterized her younger self. The country had been her salvation in ways she had not anticipated when she first arrived hollow-eyed and broken, for in the absence of society's scrutiny, she had discovered that her worth need not be measured by ballroom accomplishments or a duke's assessment, that there existed other metrics by which a woman might judge herself valuable. She had taken over management of the estate's tenant welfare from her father's steward, discovering an aptitude for practical compassion that expressed itself in improved cottages, fair rents, and the kind of personal attention to families' needs that built genuine respect rather than mere deference. Most significantly, she had established a small school for the village children, converting an unused barn into a cheerful space where she taught letters and numbers 3 days a week, watching young minds unfold with a satisfaction that no London season could have provided, and in their unaffected affection, she found a validation that healed something the Duke's words had wounded. Her days acquired rhythm and meaning: mornings with account books and correspondence, afternoons at the school or visiting tenants, evenings reading in the library, where she had educated herself with a thoroughness that her brief season's preparation had never included. Devouring philosophy and poetry, history and politics, becoming someone of substance rather than merely ornament. Charlotte wrote faithfully from London, her letters filled with gossip and observations that Rosalind read with detached amusement, finding that the world which had once seemed so important now appeared rather small and foolish from her rural vantage point. And yet when Charlotte mentioned with the careful casualness of one testing dangerous waters that the Duke of Winterbourne remained unmarried despite countless opportunities, that he had rejected every eligible lady presented to him with the same cold courtesy that characterized all his dealings, Rosalind felt something flutter in her chest that she refused to name, a sensation she dismissed as merely the residual sting of old humiliation rather than anything resembling continued interest in a man who had publicly declared her inadequate. She told herself she was indifferent, that she never thought of him, that the memory of his dark eyes and severe countenance had faded into insignificance. But this was a lie she recognized even as she constructed it, for some part of her still wondered what she had lacked that made her so thoroughly unsuitable in his estimation, still carried the scar of his rejection even as she built a life that needed neither his approval nor anyone else's. As autumn painted the Somerset hills in shades of amber and crimson, as the air acquired that particular crispness that heralded transformation, Rosalind stood in her garden watching leaves spiral earthward and felt with the force of premonition that change was approaching, though she could not have said what form it would take, only that the peaceful equilibrium she had constructed was about to be disturbed by forces beyond her control, and that somewhere in London a man she had not seen in 3 years was thinking of her with an intensity that would have shocked her had she known, watching the same autumn sky and making decisions that would shatter the careful distance they had maintained, that would bring their lives crashing together once more with consequences neither could yet imagine. The letter arrived on a morning in late November, when frost still silvered the garden paths, and Rosalind's breath misted in the air as she walked back from the village school, carrying in her hands correspondence from her father that she opened with no particular anticipation expecting the usual business matters and familial updates, only to find words that stopped her mid-step on the gravel drive. Her betrothal had been arranged to Lord Edmund Hartley, a baron of modest holdings in Kent, a gentleman of 38 who had met her briefly during a visit to Somerset the previous summer, and had subsequently written to her father expressing his sincere wish to make her his wife. Her first reaction was a curious blankness, as though the information required translation into some language she had forgotten how to speak, and she stood there reading and rereading the words while her fingers grew numb with cold, and her mind struggled to encompass this sudden alteration of her future. This unexpected resurrection of possibilities she had quietly buried during 3 years of rural contentment. Lord Hartley was, by all accounts and her own limited observation, a kind man, unremarkable perhaps in appearance and conversation, his features pleasant without being handsome, his manner courteous without being charming, but possessed of genuine regard for her and an appreciation for her charitable work that suggested compatibility of values, if not of passion. Her father's letter outlined the arrangements with obvious satisfaction: a spring wedding, a comfortable settlement, the merging of 2 respectable families, and while no mention was made of love or affection, the practical advantages were presented with the assumption that Rosalind, at 20 and without other prospects, would recognize this as the sensible opportunity it represented, the chance to fulfill her duty and secure her position despite the disaster of her London season. She felt gratitude, certainly, a warm appreciation that someone should value her enough to offer marriage, but beneath that gratitude stirred something that might have been disappointment or perhaps merely the ghost of younger dreams, the recognition that she would be accepting companionship rather than passion, security rather than romance. And yet what right had she to expect more? What claim could she make to the fairy tale love that Charlotte still believed in with the optimism of youth? That evening she wrote her acceptance, her pen moving steadily across paper as she composed words of appropriate appreciation and modest pleasure, and if her heart remained curiously unmoved by the prospect of becoming Lady Hartley, she told herself that contentment was a worthier goal than passion, that respect and kindness provided better foundation for marriage than the dangerous intensity of romantic feeling, and that she was fortunate indeed to have this second chance at a future she had thought foreclosed. Meanwhile, in London, in the card-room of White's where gentlemen gathered to drink brandy and exchange the day's gossip, the Duke of Winterbourne heard Lord Edmund Hartley's name mentioned in connection with Miss Rosalind Pemberton of Somerset, and those who observed him in that moment witnessed something unprecedented: the fracture of his legendary composure, a visible tension that seized his frame for one betraying instant before control reasserted itself, and though he said nothing, though he merely set down his glass with careful precision and excused himself with his usual cold courtesy, those present remarked later that they had never seen Winterbourne so affected, that some deep disturbance had shown itself in his eyes before the ice closed over it again. That very night he made inquiries about Lord Hartley, his finances, his character, his holdings, his history with a thoroughness that suggested far more than casual interest, and in the privacy of his study he stood at the window overlooking the darkened square and thought of Rosalind with an intensity that would have shocked anyone who believed him, incapable of such feeling, his hands clenched behind his back as he wrestled with knowledge. He had spent 3 years refusing to acknowledge that he had been tracking her life from afar through carefully maintained sources, that he knew of her school and her charitable work and the quiet dignity with which she had built a life from the ruins of her humiliation, and that the news of her betrothal had struck him with the force of physical pain, revealing at last what he had hidden even from himself, that she had haunted every day of those 3 years, that she remained present in his thoughts with a constancy that mocked his attempts at indifference, and that the idea of her belonging to another man was insupportable in ways that demanded immediate action, even as he could not yet name what form that action must take. The months that followed Rosalind's acceptance of Lord Hartley's proposal passed with the strange unreality of a play in which she performed a role without quite inhabiting it, going through the motions of wedding preparations with dutiful attention while some essential part of herself remained detached, observing from a distance as trousseau fabrics were selected and guest lists compiled, and her mother fussed over details that seemed to matter tremendously to everyone but the bride herself. Lord Hartley visited the estate twice during this period, stays of several days each that confirmed Rosalind's initial assessment. He was kind, considerate, utterly reliable, and inspired in her nothing beyond mild affection and the comfortable certainty that their marriage would be pleasant if passionless, a union of mutual respect rather than romantic feeling, and she told herself repeatedly that this was sufficient, that she was fortunate, that contentment was a worthier foundation than the dangerous intensity of love. They walked the estate paths together in companionable conversation about practical matters, household management, his expectations for their life in Kent, her hopes to continue some form of charitable work, and if his hand in hers produced no flutter of excitement, if his chaste kisses on her cheek stirred nothing in her blood, she dismissed such observations as the foolish remnants of girlish fantasy, the dangerous dreams that had no place in a woman's sensible life. The wedding was set for the 3rd week of April, and as that date approached, Rosalind found herself moving through each day with increasing detachment, as though she was slowly disappearing from her own life, becoming a ghost in her own story, and yet she could not have articulated what she wanted instead, only that some vital spark seemed to be extinguishing itself in preparation for a future that promised security at the cost of something she could not name. Then, a fortnight before the ceremony, when spring had dressed the Somerset Hills in new green and the village hummed with anticipation of the wedding, Lord Hartley arrived unexpectedly and requested a private audience with Rosalind in the drawing-room, and the moment she saw his face anguished, apologetic, unable to meet her eyes, she knew with cold certainty what he had come to say. His words tumbled out in a rush of profuse apology and evident distress. He had discovered, he claimed, that his heart belonged to another, a realization that had come upon him with the force of revelation and could not be denied. And though he held Rosalind in the highest esteem and valued her beyond measure, he could not in good conscience proceed with their marriage when his affections were so decidedly engaged elsewhere, and he begged her forgiveness for this unconscionable breach of honor, this terrible injury he had never intended to inflict. Rosalind sat frozen as he spoke, experiencing not heartbreak but a curious mixture of confusion and renewed humiliation, the sick recognition that once again she had been deemed insufficient, that some fatal flaw in her character or person rendered her perpetually unsuitable for marriage, and beneath that immediate reaction stirred something darker, a growing suspicion that her life was somehow cursed, that happiness would forever elude her grasp, slipping away at the very moment it seemed secured. She accepted his apologies with numb courtesy, released him from their engagement with words that sounded calm despite the chaos beneath, and watched him depart with visible relief at her graciousness, never suspecting that his sudden change of heart had been engineered by forces she could not imagine, that in London the Duke of Winterbourne had quietly arranged a far more advantageous match for Lord Hartley, with a wealthy heiress whose substantial dowry and family connections made Rosalind's modest attractions pale by comparison, had ensured through careful manipulation that the Baron would break his Somerset engagement in favor of this superior opportunity, had orchestrated the entire affair with cold precision while telling himself he was acting in Rosalind's best interest, that she deserved better than a passionless marriage to an unremarkable man, though he did not examine too closely why he should care so intensely about her happiness or why the news of her betrothal had driven him to such interference. In the aftermath, as Rosalind returned to the spinsterhood she had briefly escaped, as she endured her parents' disappointment and the village's renewed pity and her own growing cynicism about the possibility of marriage, the Duke stood at his London window and thought of her with an obsession that was beginning to frighten him in its intensity, wondering if he had done right, if his protection of her from mediocrity justified his arrogant interference, and never quite acknowledging the truth that was becoming impossible to deny, that he wanted her for himself with a desperation that mocked every pretense of noble motivation, that he had destroyed her chance at contentment not for her sake, but for his own selfish, desperate, utterly consuming need to keep her unattached, available, waiting though for what, he could not yet admit even to himself. Spring arrived in 1822 with a gentleness that felt almost apologetic, as though nature itself sought to soothe the wounds of Rosalind's broken engagement, clothing the Somerset Hills in soft green and filling the air with the scent of apple blossoms and fresh earth, and she threw herself into her charitable work with an intensity that bordered on desperation, rising before dawn to visit tenant families, spending long hours at the village school where children's laughter provided temporary reprieve from her thoughts, organizing a lending library and a small medical dispensary that kept her hands busy and her mind mercifully occupied. The humiliation of Lord Hartley's defection had settled into a dull ache she carried with practiced stoicism, and if the village still whispered about poor Miss Pemberton's misfortunes, she held her head high and refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken, though in private moments she sometimes wept with a bitterness that frightened her in its intensity, grieving not for Hartley himself but for the loss of hope, the growing conviction that marriage and happiness were simply not meant for women like her, that some fundamental unworthiness marked her as perpetually unsuitable despite all her efforts at improvement. It was during one such visit to the Thornbury estate, where she had gone to deliver preserves to the housekeeper, that she first encountered Captain James Whitmore, a naval officer of 32, who was recovering from injuries sustained during the war at the home of his cousin, Lord Thornbury, and their meeting was unremarkable in its ordinariness, a chance encounter in the library where she had been invited to wait, his polite greeting as he entered seeking a book, their tentative conversation about the volume he selected, and yet something in his thoughtful manner and the intelligence in his eyes suggested possibilities she had not anticipated, stirring a cautious interest that surprised her with its quiet persistence. He called at the Pemberton estate the following week, ostensibly to return a book she had recommended, and their conversation stretched into an hour, then 2, ranging across topics of literature and philosophy and his experiences at sea. And Rosalind found herself genuinely engaged in a way she had not been with Lord Hartley, appreciating the captain's intellectual curiosity and his respectful treatment of her opinions, the sense that he saw her as a person rather than merely a prospective wife. Through the warming months their friendship deepened with gradual, careful increments walks through the village, where he showed genuine interest in her charitable projects. Afternoons in the Pemberton Gardens discussing books and ideas, his attendance at the school's modest festival, where she watched him interact with easy kindness toward the tenant children, and by midsummer there existed between them an understanding, unspoken but unmistakable, that their attachment was becoming something more than friendship, that he was courting her with a gentleness that respected her bruised heart and allowed her to open herself at her own pace. Captain Whitmore's regard was utterly genuine, his admiration for her character and accomplishments expressed in quiet compliments and thoughtful gestures, and Rosalind found herself beginning to believe, with tentative and trembling hope, that perhaps contentment was possible after all, that perhaps this kind, intelligent man might offer the companionship and respect that would constitute a good life, even if it lacked the passionate intensity of romantic novels. And when he spoke of his plans to purchase a small estate in Devon, once his health fully recovered, his casual inclusion of her in those future visions made her heart lift with something that might, given time, grow into love, or at least into the steady affection she had convinced herself was sufficient for happiness, and more than she had any right to expect, given her history of romantic failure. The Duke of Winterbourne stood at the rain-streaked window of his London townhouse that summer of 1822, his reflection ghost-like against the darkness beyond, and felt the carefully constructed walls of his self-control beginning to crack under the pressure of an obsession that had grown from manageable awareness into consuming necessity, a constant presence that invaded his thoughts during parliamentary sessions and social obligations, and the long, sleepless hours when he lay alone in his bed and imagined Rosalind Pemberton in Somerset, living a life he could observe only from this careful distance, but never touch, never enter, never claim as his own, though every fibre of his being screamed for exactly that forbidden intimacy. His correspondence with carefully selected sources, a cousin who lived near the Pemberton estate, a solicitor who handled local affairs, even the vicar whose discretion could be purchased, had kept him informed of her activities with a thoroughness that would have shamed him had he allowed himself to examine his actions too closely, and through these reports he had followed her recovery from Hartley's defection, her return to charitable work, and now, most unbearably, her growing attachment to Captain James Whitmore, each mention of the naval officer's name producing a surge of jealousy so violent it surprised him with its physical intensity, a sick churning in his gut and tightness in his chest that made it difficult to breathe, as though his body were rejecting the very idea of her happiness with another man. He maintained his cold facade in society, attended his clubs, and fulfilled his duties with the same icy precision that had made him legendary among the ton. But internally a war raged between the man he had trained himself to be and the desperate, possessive creature that thoughts of Rosalind had awakened, and in the deep hours of night when defenses crumbled, he found himself returning obsessively to memories of her debut season, memories he had locked away but which now flooded back with aching clarity. The way candlelight had caught in her dark hair during that first ball, the nervous hope in her eyes as she'd watched the dancing, the kindness with which she'd treated a clumsy footman who'd spilled champagne, the sound of her laughter genuine and unaffected when her sister had whispered something amusing, and above all the warmth that seemed to radiate from her very being, a quality so foreign to his own frozen existence that it had terrified him even as it drew him with inexorable force. He had noticed everything about her during those few weeks she'd been in London, had found himself watching her when he should have been attending to other matters, had felt something dangerous stirring in his chest whenever she entered a room, and that danger had driven him to his cruel declaration of her unsuitability, words calculated to drive her away because he had known with absolute certainty that he was too damaged by his father's brutal training in emotional detachment to deserve someone so full of life and hope, that his touch would only dim her light, his coldness eventually extinguish her warmth. And so he had protected her, the only way he knew, by driving her away with public humiliation, ensuring she would never look at him with anything but loathing, never expect from him the love and tenderness she deserved, and he believed himself incapable of providing. But the years since had taught him a bitter lesson, that self-sacrifice had brought neither of them peace, that his noble gesture of rejection had wounded her while leaving him trapped in a half-life of endless wanting, and that watching her move toward happiness with other men was an exquisite torture he could no longer endure. And as he stood at that rain-washed window reading the latest report that mentioned Whitmore's increasing attentions and the village's expectation of an imminent betrothal, Nicholas Ashcroft, Duke of Winterbourne, came to a realization that was both liberation and damnation. He had wasted years in cowardice, had caused them both immeasurable pain through his arrogant assumption that he knew what was best for her, and if he did not act now, act decisively and without the protective distance he had maintained, he would lose her forever to a man who might be worthy, but who could never love her with the desperate, consuming intensity that had been building in Nicholas's chest for 6 long years, and the thought of that loss was suddenly more terrifying than any risk to his carefully guarded heart, more unbearable than the vulnerability that claiming her would require, and so he made his decision with the cold calculation that had served him in every other arena of his life. He would intervene once more, would remove this obstacle as he had removed Hartley, and then, and this was the leap into unknown territory that made his pulse quicken with something that might have been fear or anticipation, he would finally step out of the shadows and claim what he had wanted from the moment he first saw her. Consequences be damned. Autumn arrived in Somerset with a chill that seemed to mirror the frost gathering in Rosalind's heart. But in London, Captain James Whitmore received an unexpected visitor whose arrival would alter the course of both their lives, for the Duke of Winterbourne appeared at the modest rooms the captain had taken near the Admiralty, with a proposition that seemed to answer prayers the naval officer had scarcely dared to voice, speaking in measured tones of a prestigious expedition to chart the waters of the South Pacific. A 3-year voyage that would require a commander of proven courage and navigational skill, an opportunity that could establish Whitmore's reputation and secure his future in ways his current half-pay status never could, and the Duke presented this offer with such careful neutrality that it seemed mere patronage, an act of noblesse oblige toward a deserving officer, though beneath his controlled facade, Nicholas felt the familiar sickness of manipulation even as he pressed forward with cold determination, watching the captain's face transform from confusion to dawning hope to anguished conflict as the full implications became clear. "The expedition departs in a fortnight," the Duke said with deliberate gentleness, knowing the timeline made choice impossible, made deliberation a luxury the captain could not afford. "The Admiralty requires an immediate answer, and I confess I could think of no man more suited to the command, Captain Whitmore, having made inquiries into your distinguished service record." And James Whitmore, honourable man that he was, understood immediately the terrible choice being offered career advancement beyond his wildest expectations, the kind of opportunity that came perhaps once in a lifetime and would secure not just his own future, but his ability to provide for a family, to offer Rosalind the comfortable life she deserved, set against the certainty that accepting meant abandoning her for 3 years, leaving her without the proposal he had been gathering courage to make, risking that she might not wait, or that some other suitor might claim her in his absence. And the captain's hands trembled slightly as he held the official documents the Duke had brought, his mind racing through impossible calculations of duty and desire, ambition and love. He travelled to Somerset 3 days later, his decision made with the kind of practical nobility that had defined his military service, and Rosalind knew the moment she saw his face in the Pemberton drawing-room that something had shattered, could read in his pained expression and careful words the end of the tentative future they had been building. And when he explained about the expedition, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke of the honor and the opportunity and the impossibility of refusing such a career-defining command, she felt something inside her crack with an audible finality, a breaking deeper than Hartley's defection, because this time she had allowed herself genuine hope, had opened her wounded heart to the possibility of happiness, only to have it torn away with exquisite timing that seemed almost cosmically cruel. "I would ask you to wait," James said, taking her cold hands in his, "but I have no right to request 3 years of your life, to ask you to remain in uncertainty while I sail halfway around the world, and yet I cannot help hoping." But his words trailed into miserable silence because they both understood the impossibility, understood that 3 years was an eternity, and that life could not simply pause while he pursued glory in distant waters. And so they said their farewells in the garden, where they had walked so many pleasant afternoons, his departure marked by tears on both sides, and promises they both knew might prove impossible to keep. And Rosalind stood alone among the fading roses after his carriage disappeared down the drive, her hands pressed to her mouth to hold back the sobs that threatened to overwhelm her fragile composure. What she did not see was the Duke's carriage stationed on the lane beyond the estate gates, or the man inside watching her solitary figure with an expression that mingled triumph and self-loathing. Nicholas's hands clenched white-knuckled against his thighs as he witnessed the devastation his interference had wrought, the way her shoulders shook with weeping, and in that moment he felt the full weight of his actions settle upon him like a physical burden. The recognition that he had caused this pain to the woman he claimed to love, had stolen her chance at contentment out of selfish desperation, he could no longer pretend was protection. And yet, even as shame burned through him, he could not entirely regret his choice, could not wish Whitmore back to claim her, and this fundamental selfishness terrified him with its intensity, even as it drove him forward toward the confrontation he knew must come. Winter descended upon Somerset that year with a cruelty that seemed to mirror the ice forming around Rosalind's battered heart. The bare trees and frozen ground, reflecting back the desolation she felt in those long months following Captain Whitmore's departure, and as snow blanketed the estate in January, she found herself moving through the days with mechanical precision, fulfilling her duties to the village school and tenant families with the same dedication, but none of the warmth that had once infused her work. And it was Charlotte who finally broke through the numbness one bitter afternoon as they sat in the morning room watching sleet strike the windows, her younger sister's voice cutting through Rosalind's fog of misery with words that were part concern and part exasperation. "You cannot continue like this, hiding away as though happiness is something that happens only to other people," Charlotte said, setting down her embroidery with unusual force, and Rosalind looked up from the ledgers she had been pretending to review and felt something shift inside her, grief crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous, anger, pure and clarifying, directed not at James, who had made an impossible but understandable choice, not even at fate or circumstance, but at herself for her continued passivity, her acceptance of disappointment as though it were her natural destiny. And in that moment, she made a decision that was born of desperation and fury in equal measure. "You are quite right," Rosalind said, her voice carrying an edge her sister had never heard before, cold and determined. "I refuse to accept that love is impossible for me, that I am somehow cursed to watch happiness slip away again and again while I remain frozen in perpetual waiting. And so I have decided. I will marry the next suitable man who asks, Charlotte, regardless of romantic feeling or passionate attachment. because clearly those sentiments lead only to heartbreak, and I would rather have companionship and security than continue hoping for something that seems determined to elude me." Charlotte's shocked silence spoke volumes, but Rosalind continued, the words tumbling out with the force of long-suppressed determination. "I am 23, no longer a girl who can afford to dream of love matches and soul-deep connections, and I will not become a figure of pity, the Pemberton daughter whose mysterious misfortunes provide entertainment for village gossips. So the next gentleman who offers marriage with sincerity will find me remarkably practical and acceptably enthusiastic, and we shall build whatever life can be built on mutual respect and reasonable expectations." The hardness in her own voice frightened her slightly, the recognition that something essential had changed in her character, that the warm and hopeful girl she had been was being deliberately buried beneath layers of protective cynicism, but the alternative, remaining vulnerable to future devastation, seemed unbearable. And so she embraced this new, cold pragmatism as armor against further wounds, began accepting social invitations again, with a brittle brightness that worried Charlotte, even as it silenced the pitying whispers, and moved through the remainder of that harsh winter with walls built so high around her heart that she barely recognized herself in the mirror. Meanwhile, in London, the Duke of Winterbourne sat in his study on a February evening, reading the latest report from Somerset, and the description of Rosalind's changed demeanor, her hardened manner, her declared intention to accept the next proposal regardless of feeling struck him with the force of a physical blow. The recognition that his interference had not protected her but rather had damaged something precious and irreplaceable, had transformed her warmth into ice that mirrored his own frozen heart, and in that moment Nicholas faced an internal crisis that shook the foundations of his carefully constructed justifications. He could continue as he had been, manipulating circumstances from the shadows while telling himself he was protecting her from his own inadequacy, or he could finally, terrifyingly, step into the light and confess the truth of what he had done and why, risking her hatred and rejection, but at least giving her the choice he had stolen twice before. And the cowardice of the first option suddenly seemed more unbearable than the vulnerability of the second, though he sat frozen in indecision as winter deepened and the reports from Somerset grew more alarming, and he knew with sick certainty that time was running out to undo the damage his arrogant interference had wrought. Spring arrived in Somerset in 1823, with a profusion of apple blossoms and gentle warmth that seemed to mock the coldness Rosalind had cultivated through the long winter, and it was during the May Day village festival that Mr. Thomas Wickford first appeared at the Pemberton estate, introduced by her father as the son of a successful textile merchant who had made his fortune in Manchester and was now seeking to establish his family among the landed gentry, and Rosalind understood immediately what manner of man stood before her in the drawing-room, not unkind but undeniably pompous, his words carefully practiced, and his manner that of someone auditioning for a role rather than seeking genuine connection, speaking of his appreciation for the finer things and his desire to ally himself with families of true breeding and refinement in ways that made clear he valued her pedigree far more than her person. And yet when he requested permission to call upon her, she found herself accepting with the mechanical politeness that had become her default manner, telling herself that his motivations mattered less than his apparent stability and the fact that he seemed unlikely to suddenly discover pressing business in distant oceans or formerly unknown passions for other women. The courtship that followed was marked by expensive gifts that demonstrated his wealth rather than any understanding of her tastes, elaborate jewelry when she preferred simple pieces, hothouse flowers in overwhelming arrangements when she loved the wildflowers from the estate gardens, leather-bound volumes of popular novels when her library was filled with philosophy and social reform treatises, and his conversation ran to boastful accounts of his father's business successes and his own plans to purchase a larger estate where he might entertain persons of consequence. And through it all Rosalind smiled and nodded and felt absolutely nothing, which was precisely what she had determined she wanted, this numbness that protected her from further devastation even as it hollowed her out from within. When Mr. Wickford proposed after a mere 6 weeks of acquaintance, kneeling in the Pemberton drawing-room with a speech that seemed rehearsed before a mirror and a ring that was ostentatiously large, Rosalind accepted with calm resignation, and the betrothal was announced with unseemly haste because Wickford was eager to formalize his entry into genteel society, and she saw no reason to delay what was clearly a practical arrangement rather than a romantic attachment, and a summer wedding was set with mechanical efficiency, while Rosalind moved through the preparations with the emotional engagement of someone organizing household accounts rather than her own nuptials. Charlotte watched her sister's performance with growing alarm, seeing the way Rosalind's smiles never reached her eyes, how she spoke of the wedding arrangements in the same tone she used for discussing crop rotations with the estate steward. And one evening, she confronted Rosalind directly in her chambers, demanding to know how she could contemplate marrying a man she clearly did not love. But Rosalind's response was delivered with brittle certainty. "Love has brought me nothing but pain, Charlotte, and I will not be fool enough to seek it again when companionship and security are far more reliable foundations for marriage. And Mr. Wickford will provide both adequately enough, and I shall be content with adequacy, since happiness seems determined to elude me regardless of what I desire." Meanwhile in London, the Duke of Winterbourne received word of the betrothal from his usual sources, and the report landed on his desk like a condemnation, the description of Thomas Wickford pompous, status-seeking, utterly incapable of appreciating the remarkable woman he was acquiring, like one might purchase a particularly prestigious piece of property, filling Nicholas with a horror that went beyond jealousy into something approaching existential dread, the recognition that this match would not simply remove Rosalind from his reach, but would actively destroy whatever remained of her spirit, would trap her in a gilded cage with a man who valued her lineage over her character, and would slowly suffocate the warmth and intelligence that made her extraordinary. And in that moment, the Duke understood with crystalline clarity that he could no longer justify his cowardice with claims of protecting her, that his interference from the shadows had caused nothing but harm, and that if he truly loved her, and God help him, he did, with an intensity that terrified him with its completeness, then he owed her the truth spoken openly, the choice offered honestly, even if it meant facing her hatred and rejection, even if it meant finally, terrifyingly, stepping into the light and risking the vulnerability he had spent his entire adult life avoiding. And so Nicholas Ashcroft, Duke of Winterbourne, made his decision with hands that trembled slightly as he wrote instructions for his carriage to be prepared for Somerset, knowing that he rode toward either salvation or final, irrevocable damnation, and that this time the consequences would be entirely, appropriately his to bear. The Duke of Winterbourne's carriage arrived at the Pemberton estate on a late May afternoon, when the gardens were heavy with the scent of lilac and early roses, and the sight of the ducal crest upon the gleaming black vehicle caused immediate consternation among the household staff, whispers racing through the manor with the speed of wildfire, as servants tried to comprehend what business His Grace could possibly have in Somerset. And when the butler announced the Duke's presence in the entrance hall requesting audience with the family, Rosalind felt her blood turn to ice in her veins, her teacup frozen halfway to her lips as she sat in the drawing room with Charlotte and their mother, and for one terrible moment she was 17 again, standing in that ballroom while his cold voice pronounced her thoroughly unsuitable, the humiliation as fresh as though 6 years had not passed since that devastating night. Her father emerged from his study with an expression of barely contained excitement, the eagerness of a man who saw opportunity in the unexpected arrival of one of England's most eligible peers. But when Rosalind entered the formal parlour where their guest waited and saw Nicholas Ashcroft standing by the windows in his perfectly tailored coat, his dark hair touched with the afternoon light, his aristocratic features as coldly beautiful as she remembered, she felt anger rise in her throat like bile, her hands clenching at her sides as she executed the barest curtsy that civility demanded, while her eyes blazed with undisguised hostility. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying an edge sharp enough to draw blood, "I confess myself astonished by your presence here, as I cannot imagine what business you might have with our family, given your previous assessment of my complete unsuitability for anyone of your elevated station." And she saw something flicker in his grey eyes, pain, perhaps, or recognition of the wound he had inflicted, but his voice when he spoke was carefully measured, formal, as he requested the honour of speaking with Miss Pemberton privately on a matter of some importance. Her father's agreement came with mortifying speed, his protests about propriety utterly abandoned in his enthusiasm to facilitate whatever connection the Duke sought, and despite Rosalind's sharp objection, she found herself being ushered into the garden, with Charlotte dispatched to serve as distant chaperone, her sister positioning herself on a bench near the house, while Rosalind walked stiffly down the gravel path with the Duke following at a respectful distance, the tension between them crackling like lightning before a storm. They stopped beside the fountain where water lilies bloomed in the basin, and Rosalind turned to face him with arms crossed defensively, waiting for him to speak first. And when he did, his words were careful, chosen with obvious precision. "Miss Pemberton, I have come to request permission to pay my addresses to you, to court you properly with the intention of seeking your hand in marriage." The request was so absurd, so utterly incomprehensible given their history, that Rosalind laughed, a bitter sound devoid of humor that seemed to echo in the garden air, and her response came swift and cutting. "You declared me unsuitable 6 years ago before the entirety of London society, Your Grace, and now you travel to Somerset to request courtship? Forgive me if I find your sudden interest not merely surprising but insulting, a joke in spectacularly poor taste, and I must ask you to leave immediately before this farce continues any further." The Duke did not move from his position beside the fountain, though Rosalind saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a gravity that compelled her attention despite her fury. "I did not speak in jest that night, Miss Pemberton. I spoke in fear, and every word was false, a cruelty I have regretted every day since, but lacked the courage to correct until circumstances have forced my hand." And Rosalind felt her breath catch at this admission, though her anger did not diminish, only shifted into something more complex and dangerous. She demanded clarification with barely restrained hostility, asking how he could expect her to believe such a convenient reinterpretation of words that had shaped 6 years of her life, that had sent her fleeing from London in shame, that had convinced her she was somehow fundamentally inadequate. And his response came with an honesty that seemed to cost him something essential. "Because I have watched you, Miss Pemberton. From a distance, I maintained, out of cowardice, and I have witnessed the woman you became, your establishment of the village school, your compassionate management of tenant concerns, your strength in solitude when lesser souls would have grown bitter, and I have known for years that my assessment was not merely wrong but deliberately, catastrophically false, spoken to protect you from a man I believed incapable of offering you the warmth and devotion you deserved." Rosalind stared at him with something approaching horror as understanding began to dawn, her mind working through the implications of his words, and she asked with dangerous quiet whether he was confessing to having observed her life these past years, and his affirmative answer sent ice through her veins, even as something else, something she refused to name, flickered in her chest. She accused him of having no right to such surveillance, to such presumption about what she deserved or required, asking with cutting precision why, if he had admired her transformation, he had remained silent, why he had allowed her to continue believing herself inadequate, and she watched his aristocratic composure crack slightly as he struggled to articulate emotions clearly unfamiliar to him. "Because I am my father's son," Miss Pemberton, raised in coldness and taught that sentiment was weakness, and I believed myself too damaged, too frozen at my core, to offer you anything but contamination of your warmth, and so I told myself that distance was kindness, that my silence was protection, when in truth it was merely cowardice dressed in noble justification. Rosalind felt her anger warring with an unwilling understanding as she recognized in his confession the same fear that had driven her own retreat from vulnerability. But she refused to soften, telling him sharply that he had no right to make such decisions for her, that his protection was indistinguishable from the very cruelty he claimed to regret, and above them the sky darkened as clouds gathered with the promise of storm, the air growing heavy with approaching rain as their confrontation reached its critical juncture, and she saw in his grey eyes something she had never expected to find, their genuine anguish, the recognition of harm done, and the desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, it might yet be forgiven. The confrontation deepened as the air grew heavier with the approaching storm, and Rosalind found herself trembling not merely with anger, but with a terrible suspicion that was beginning to crystallize in her mind, the pieces of a puzzle she had not known existed suddenly arranging themselves into a devastating pattern. "Your Grace," she said with dangerous calm, her eyes searching his face with new intensity, "I find myself curious about a particular matter you speak of, having observed my life from afar these past years, of having witnessed my transformation, And yet there is something you have not addressed. Two peculiar coincidences that have shaped my recent history in ways I am only now beginning to question." She watched his expression carefully as she continued, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "Lord Hartley broke our engagement quite suddenly 2 weeks before our wedding, claiming to have discovered his heart belonged to another, and Captain Whitmore departed just as suddenly for a naval expedition that required his immediate departure for 3 years. And I wonder, Your Grace, whether a man who confesses to having watched me from shadows might also have interfered more directly in circumstances he deemed unsuitable." The Duke's face revealed the truth before his words could form. A flicker of something: guilt, recognition, the realization that this moment of reckoning had arrived, passing across his aristocratic features, and Rosalind felt shock transform into a fury so profound it left her breathless, her hands clenching into fists at her sides as she demanded confirmation of what she already knew. His admission came carefully, each word measured as though he were navigating a field strewn with explosives. "I ensured that Lord Hartley received a more advantageous offer that would appeal to his ambitions, yes, and I provided Captain Whitmore with an opportunity that his honor and career aspirations would not permit him to refuse, because neither man was worthy of you, Miss Pemberton, neither possessed the depth of feeling or strength of character to deserve what you offered." Rosalind's fury exploded with the first drops of rain that began to fall, her voice rising as she accused him of monstrous arrogance, of stealing her choices and manipulating her life as though she were a chess piece rather than a human being with autonomy and agency. And she told him with cutting precision that he had destroyed not 1 but 2 chances at happiness, had left her believing herself somehow cursed or fundamentally unlovable, had caused her to doubt her own worth when the true villain stood before her, cloaked in ducal pride and self-righteous justification. The Duke attempted to defend his actions by insisting that neither Hartley nor Whitmore truly loved her as she deserved, that their departure proved their inadequacy. But Rosalind's response cut through his reasoning like a blade. "And what of you, Your Grace? You, who declared me unsuitable, who watched in silence while I rebuilt myself from shame, who destroyed my betrothals while maintaining your distance, what possible claim do you have to worthiness? You are no better than the men you dismissed. Indeed, you are worse, for at least they possessed the honesty to court me openly, rather than manipulating my life from shadows." She demanded that he leave immediately and never return, her voice shaking with the force of her anger and the betrayal that cut deeper than she wanted to acknowledge. But the Duke remained rooted beside the fountain, even as the rain began to fall more steadily, and his voice when he spoke carried a desperation she had never heard from him. "I will not leave until you have heard everything, Miss Pemberton, until you understand the full measure of my failures and the truth that has driven every terrible decision, because you deserve at minimum the honesty I should have offered 6 years ago, and if after hearing all you still command me to go, I will honor that request and never trouble you again." The rain fell harder now, drops striking the fountain's surface and soaking through their clothing, but neither moved from their positions in the garden as the storm that had been gathering finally broke above them. The rain fell steadily now, soaking through Rosalind's muslin dress and plastering the Duke's dark hair to his forehead, but neither seemed to notice the deluge as he began to speak with a raw honesty that stripped away every carefully maintained layer of aristocratic reserve, his voice rough with emotion as he told her what he had never told another living soul. "My father, the 7th Duke of Winterbourne, was a man who believed that sentiment was the greatest weakness a nobleman could possess, that love made one vulnerable, and vulnerability was tantamount to failure, and from my earliest memory he trained me in coldness as other fathers might train their sons in honor or duty." Rosalind found herself listening despite her fury, watching water stream down his face as he continued with visible difficulty, explaining that his mother had died when he was 7, that his father had forbidden him to weep at her funeral, had struck him when tears fell anyway, teaching him that emotions were to be buried so deep they ceased to exist, and that by the time he reached manhood, he had become exactly what his father intended, frozen at his core, incapable of warmth, viewing every human interaction through the lens of utility and advantage rather than genuine connection. By 25, I was considered London's most eligible bachelor, and its coldest, a man who could calculate the political advantage of every potential match, but felt nothing when I looked at the carefully selected young women paraded before me," he said, his grey eyes holding hers with desperate intensity. "And then I attended Lady Ashworth's ball and saw you, Miss Pemberton, 17 years old, and filled with such hope, such unguarded warmth. And for the first time in my adult life I felt something crack in the ice that encased my heart, a terrifying awareness that I wanted what you possessed, that capacity for joy, for authentic feeling, for connection unmarred by calculation." Rosalind's breath caught as he confessed that he had watched her throughout that evening, had noticed her kindness to a nervous wallflower, her genuine laughter at her friend's jest, the way she looked at the world as though it held wonder rather than merely opportunity, and he had recognized in that moment that she deserved someone capable of matching her warmth, someone who could offer her love rather than the hollow shell of duty he possessed. And so when her father approached him about a potential match, he had made the cruelest decision of his life to drive her away, with words designed to wound, to ensure she would never waste her brightness on his darkness. "I told myself I was protecting you," he said with bitter self-recrimination. "But in truth I was a coward who destroyed something precious because I lacked the courage to attempt becoming worthy of it. And in the years since I have been unable to forget you, Miss Pemberton, unable to stop wondering about your life. And when I learned you had transformed yourself into everything I knew you would become, compassionate, strong, purposeful, I found myself consumed by a love I had no right to feel, a desperate, selfish obsession that drove me to interfere in your betrothals because I could not bear the thought of another man possessing what I had been too damaged to claim." He acknowledged with devastating honesty that his actions were indefensible, that he had stolen her choices out of jealous possession while maintaining his cowardly distance, that she should despise him for the harm he had caused. But he needed her to understand that every terrible decision had been driven not by cruelty but by love he had spent years trying and failing to master. And now he stood before her in the pouring rain, finally honest, finally vulnerable, and he accepted that this confession might only deepen her hatred. But she deserved at minimum the truth he should have offered 6 years ago, when his words had shaped the painful trajectory of her life. They moved to the shelter of the conservatory without speaking, both drenched to the bone, water pooling on the tiled floor as they stood facing each other among the tropical plants that thrived in this glass sanctuary, and Rosalind found herself trembling not merely from the cold, but from the torrent of emotions that his confession had unleashed. Anger still burned hot in her chest, fury at years of manipulation and stolen choices, yet alongside that righteous rage lived something far more complicated, an unwilling understanding that threatened to undermine the simple clarity of her condemnation. She wrapped her arms around herself as she struggled to order her thoughts, memories flooding back unbidden to that debut season 6 years ago, when she had noticed him too, had felt her heart quicken when his grey eyes had seemed to rest upon her across the ballroom, had entertained foolish dreams of catching the attention of London's most eligible duke, before his brutal rejection had shattered those nascent hopes and taught her that she was fundamentally inadequate, unworthy, unsuitable for a man of his stature. "Your Grace," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "You speak of protecting me from your coldness, of believing yourself too damaged to deserve my warmth, and yet your actions these past years have caused me immeasurable pain. You shaped my entire understanding of my own worth, with words deliberately chosen to wound, and I spent years believing I was lacking in grace, in conversation, in the very temperament required to be loved, years during which I rebuilt myself from the ruins of that humiliation, only to have you secretly destroy 2 opportunities for happiness because you deemed the men unworthy." She watched him flinch at her words, saw genuine anguish cross his aristocratic features, and felt her anger war with the terrible recognition that beneath his cold exterior lived someone as wounded as she had been, someone who had learned in childhood that love was weakness and vulnerability was failure, someone who had been shaped by cruelty into an instrument of ice and duty. The Duke spoke then with a humility she had never imagined possible from him. "I know that I have no right to ask anything of you, Miss Pemberton, that my actions are indefensible regardless of the feelings that drove them, and if knowing the truth only deepens your hatred, then I accept that consequence because you deserved this honesty 6 years ago when I was too cowardly to offer it. and I acknowledge that my declaration of your unsuitability shaped years of pain for which I can never adequately atone, and I would undo every word if such a thing were possible, would bear any punishment you deem appropriate for the harm I have caused." Rosalind found tears mixing with the rain on her face as she confessed what she had never admitted to anyone. "I noticed you that season, Your Grace. Before my father approached you, I watched you across the ballroom and felt drawn to you in a way I did not understand. And when you declared me unsuitable before the assembled ton, it felt as though you had looked into my soul and found it wanting, as though you possessed some divine insight into inadequacies I had not known I carried. And I have spent 6 years trying to prove to myself that your assessment was wrong, while simultaneously believing it might be true." The Duke's visible anguish at this revelation struck her with unexpected force, and when he moved closer with careful deliberation, asking permission with his eyes before taking her hand in his, she did not pull away despite every rational instinct that screamed she should maintain her distance from this man who had caused her such harm. "What do you truly want from me now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and his answer came without hesitation, raw and honest. "The chance to prove myself worthy of you, Miss Pemberton, starting from nothing, from less than nothing given the debt of pain I owe, the opportunity to show you through actions, rather than words, that I can become someone deserving of your regard, someone capable of offering you the partnership and respect and genuine love you should have received from the beginning, and I know I have no right to ask for such a chance, but I am asking nonetheless because you have become the measure by which I judge every thought and action, the standard against which I find myself perpetually wanting, and I would rather spend my life attempting to earn your trust and failing than continue in the cowardly distance I have maintained these past years." Rosalind stood silently in the conservatory for a long moment, watching water drip from the Duke's dark hair onto his rain-soaked coat, feeling the weight of his confession settle over her like a physical thing, and she recognized that she stood at a precipice from which there could be no easy retreat. Whatever she decided now would shape the remaining trajectory of her life in ways she could not fully anticipate. "Your Grace," she said finally, her voice carrying a steadiness born of necessity rather than confidence, "I am engaged to Mr. Thomas Wickford, with our wedding planned for 6 weeks hence, and though I harbour no grand passion for him, I have given my word and accepted his suit with full understanding of what such a union would entail: companionship without romance, security without vulnerability, a life of modest contentment rather than the dangerous heights of feeling you now propose." She watched something flicker in his grey eyes, pain perhaps, or resignation, but he held her gaze without flinching as she continued. "Yet I find myself confronted with your confession, with this revelation of years of manipulation driven by what you claim is love, and I am torn between my righteous anger at your interference and an unwilling understanding of the wounded man who committed these actions, and I do not know which feeling to trust or whether either can guide me toward wisdom." The Duke moved closer then, careful to maintain appropriate distance, even as his intensity seemed to close the space between them, and his voice, when he spoke, carried a desperate sincerity that she had never imagined possible from London's coldest nobleman. "Miss Pemberton, I ask only this: give me these 6 weeks before your wedding to Mr. Wickford. Allow me to court you properly, as I should have done 6 years ago, to show you through honest action rather than manipulation who I truly am beneath the frozen facade I have maintained, and if at the end of that time you still choose Wickford, then I will accept your decision with grace and never interfere in your life again. I give you my word as a gentleman and as a man who loves you beyond reason that I will honor whatever choice you make." Rosalind felt her breath catch at the proposition, her mind immediately cataloguing the risks, Mr. Wickford's potential fury at such a delay, society's inevitable gossip, her own father's confusion and disappointment if she ultimately chose the Duke only to discover his professed transformation was temporary rather than genuine, and above all the terrifying vulnerability required to open her heart to someone who had already wounded it so deeply, to trust that his love was real rather than another form of aristocratic caprice that would leave her shattered beyond repair. Yet alongside these rational fears lived something else, a trembling possibility she barely dared acknowledge, that perhaps his confession held truth, that perhaps the connection she had felt 6 years ago, before his cruel rejection, had been mutual rather than imagined, that perhaps two wounded people might find healing together if they possessed courage sufficient to the attempt. "If I were to agree to such an arrangement," she said slowly, watching his face carefully for any sign of triumph or calculation, "I would require absolute honesty from you, Your Grace, no more manipulation or interference in my choices, however well-intentioned, no decisions made on my behalf, because you believe you know better what I need, and you must accept that even after 6 weeks of courtship, I may still choose Mr. Wickford, or may choose neither of you, that I may decide spinsterhood and independence serve me better than marriage to any man, regardless of his title or professed devotion." The Duke nodded immediately, his agreement swift and unequivocal. "I accept your conditions completely and without reservation, Miss Pemberton. You will have my absolute honesty, even when such truth reflects poorly upon me. You will have full autonomy over your choices, with no interference from me regardless of how those choices wound my hopes, and you will have my respect for whatever decision you ultimately make, because you deserve nothing less than complete agency over your own life and future." Rosalind studied his face in the dim light filtering through the conservatory glass, searching for any hint of the cold calculation that had characterized him 6 years ago, but she found only raw vulnerability and desperate hope that seemed entirely genuine, and against every instinct of self-preservation she heard herself say, "Very well, Your Grace, you may court me for these 6 weeks, but understand that I make no promises beyond allowing you the opportunity to prove yourself, and I will be watching carefully for any sign that your professed transformation is performance rather than genuine change, and at the first indication of manipulation or dishonesty, I will end this arrangement immediately and proceed with my marriage to Mr. Wickford regardless of whatever feelings may have developed between us." The following weeks unfolded with a careful deliberation that both surprised and unsettled Rosalind, for the Duke of Winterbourne arrived each day at precisely 11 o'clock in the morning, never presuming to stay beyond the bounds of propriety, yet never failing to appear regardless of weather or circumstance, and she found herself anticipating his visits with an eagerness that troubled her even as it thrilled her in equal measure. Their conversations began in the formal drawing-room under the watchful eye of her mother as chaperone, but gradually migrated to the garden, where spring flowers bloomed in riotous abundance, to the library where they discovered a shared love of poetry that neither had expected, to the long walks along the estate paths, where the countryside unfurled in gentle hills and ancient woodland that seemed to exist outside the constraints of London society and its rigid judgments. The Duke revealed himself in increments, each conversation peeling back another layer of the icy facade he had maintained for so many years, and Rosalind learned that beneath the cold aristocratic exterior lived a man who quoted Wordsworth with genuine feeling, who held progressive views on tenant welfare that aligned remarkably with her own charitable philosophy, who possessed a dry wit that caught her off guard and drew from her startled laughter that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. She watched him carefully during these weeks, searching for any sign of performance or calculation, any indication that his transformation was temporary artifice designed to secure her acceptance before reverting to his former coldness. But she found instead a consistent gentleness in his manner, a genuine interest in her work with the village school that manifested not merely in polite questions, but in a substantial donation that would allow her to expand the building and hire a second teacher, a quiet respect in how he spoke to her father's servants and tenant farmers that suggested this consideration was habitual rather than performed for her benefit. The contrast with Mr. Wickford's continued visits became increasingly stark as the weeks progressed, for her fiancé arrived with expensive gifts and flowery speeches that felt hollow compared to the Duke's quiet attentiveness, spoke grandly of the status she would gain as his wife, while showing little interest in her actual thoughts or aspirations, treated servants with casual dismissiveness that made her wince when compared to the Duke's careful courtesy. Rosalind felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack despite her determination to maintain emotional distance, found herself noticing small details that had no business affecting her so profoundly, the way the Duke's grey eyes softened when he looked at her, when he thought she was not observing, the careful distance he maintained, even when she sensed he wished to move closer, the vulnerability in his voice when he spoke of his lonely childhood and the cold man his father had shaped him to become, the genuine pleasure that illuminated his aristocratic features when she shared some success from her charitable work or some small confidence about her own dreams and fears. The village took notice of these daily visits from London's most eligible duke, and she endured the knowing looks from tenant families and the barely concealed curiosity of shopkeepers when she walked through the village with him at her side, showing him the school she had established and introducing him to the children who attended there, and she observed how naturally he spoke to them without condescension, how he remembered their names from one visit to the next, how his formal reserve melted into something approaching warmth when a small girl presented him with a slightly crooked drawing she had made of his impressive horse. 3 weeks into the courtship, on a bright afternoon when late spring sunshine warmed the Somerset countryside and the village prepared for its annual festival, Rosalind stood at the edge of the school grounds watching the Duke of Winterbourne kneel in the grass beside a cluster of children, his fine coat abandoned on a nearby bench, and his usually severe expression transformed by genuine amusement as a small boy named Thomas demonstrated how to launch a wooden hoop across the lawn, and she felt something shift irrevocably in her chest, a sensation like ice breaking after a long winter, her heart performing a betraying lurch that she could no longer dismiss as mere physical attraction or intellectual compatibility, but had to acknowledge as something far more dangerous and profound. She watched him listen with complete attention as young Sarah recited a poem she had learned, watched him praise her effort without condescension, watched the unguarded smile that illuminated his aristocratic features and made him look younger, less burdened, almost joyful, and she recognized with startling clarity that this was who he truly was, beneath the frozen facade he had maintained for so long. Not the cold duke who had humiliated her 6 years ago, but a man capable of warmth and tenderness, who had simply never been taught how to express such feelings until desperation and love had forced him to learn. That evening, when the festival had concluded and the children had been collected by their parents, and the Duke had stayed to help fold tables and gather scattered decorations with the same careful attention he brought to everything involving her work, they retreated to the library as had become their custom, and Rosalind found herself unable to maintain the careful emotional distance she had preserved throughout the previous weeks, her defenses crumbling under the weight of accumulated small moments that had revealed his true character more effectively than any grand gesture could have accomplished. She sat across from him in the dimness of the book-lined room, lamplight casting shadows across his angular face, and she asked the question that had been building in her heart throughout the day. "Why do you love me, Your Grace? Truly, not merely because I represent some unattainable ideal or because your pride was wounded when I rejected your manipulation, but why me specifically, when London is filled with beautiful, accomplished women who would accept your suit without hesitation and without requiring you to transform yourself so completely." The Duke was silent for a long moment, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, and then he began to speak in a voice rough with emotion, cataloguing memories she had not known. He possessed her kindness to a footman who had spilled wine at that long-ago ball, the way she had laughed at her sister's joke despite her obvious nervousness, reports from his sources over the years about her charitable work and her refusal to become bitter despite her heartbreaks, her strength in choosing solitude over settling for less than she deserved, and he told her that she had haunted him precisely because she represented everything he had been taught to suppress in himself, that her warmth and authenticity had shown him how thoroughly he had buried his own capacity for feeling, that watching her from afar had made him want to become someone worthy of her regard, even when he believed such transformation was impossible. His voice broke slightly as he admitted, "You made me want to become someone capable of love, Miss Pemberton, when I had convinced myself that such emotions were weakness rather than strength, and every day of these past 6 weeks has confirmed what I have known since that terrible night when I rejected you, that you are the finest person I have ever encountered, and that if you give me the extraordinary gift of your trust, I will spend the remainder of my life proving myself worthy of it." Rosalind felt tears sliding down her cheeks before she fully registered that she was crying, felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumbling into dust, and she heard herself say in a whisper that carried the weight of surrender and hope in equal measure, "I am falling in love with you, Your Grace, despite every rational instinct and despite my terror that you will revert to the cold man you were once I have given you my heart completely, and I do not know whether this makes me brave or foolish, but I find I no longer care which it is." The space between them seemed to collapse then, and he crossed to her chair and knelt before her as he had knelt beside the children that afternoon, and he took her hands in his, with a gentleness that belied his reputation for coldness, and he kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of years of longing finally permitted expression. Their first kiss tentative and trembling and utterly transformative, a seal upon promises made, and a beginning of something. Neither of them had believed possible when this strange courtship had commenced 3 weeks earlier. The following morning arrived with the crystalline clarity that sometimes follows profound emotional revelations, and Rosalind woke with a sense of purpose that felt both terrifying and liberating in equal measure, for she knew with absolute certainty what she must do, regardless of the social complications that would inevitably follow. She dressed carefully in a simple morning gown of pale blue muslin, her hands steady despite the magnitude of the decision she had made in the quiet hours before dawn, and she descended to the breakfast room where her mother and Charlotte were already seated, their conversation dying abruptly when they saw her expression. She requested that a message be sent to Mr. Wickford asking him to call at his earliest convenience, and her mother's immediate anxiety was palpable in the way her teacup rattled against its saucer, but Rosalind merely shook her head gently and said that all would be well, that she was finally making a choice based on truth rather than resignation or duty divorced from feeling. When Mr. Wickford arrived 2 hours later, his florid face already preparing its usual bombastic greeting, Rosalind received him in the drawing room with Charlotte as chaperone and spoke words she had rehearsed until they felt both necessary and kind, that she could not, in good conscience, proceed with their wedding, that she had come to realize their union would be built on foundations of mutual convenience rather than genuine affection, that he deserved a wife who could offer him wholehearted devotion rather than resigned acceptance. His reaction progressed swiftly, from confusion to wounded pride, to blustering threats about breach of promise and social consequences, his merchant-class anxiety about status revealing itself in increasingly shrill pronouncements about the damage to his reputation, until the butler announced the arrival of the Duke of Winterbourne, whose timing Rosalind suspected was not coincidental given his stated intention to handle any practical obstacles that might arise. The Duke entered with his characteristic aristocratic composure, but Rosalind saw the tension in his shoulders and the concern in his grey eyes as he assessed the situation, and he addressed Mr. Wickford with cool courtesy that nevertheless carried unmistakable authority, suggesting that perhaps a private conversation between gentlemen might resolve matters to everyone's satisfaction. They withdrew to her father's study, and when they emerged 20 minutes later, Mr. Wickford's expression had transformed from aggrieved anger to calculating satisfaction, and he departed with stiff formality that suggested wounded pride, soothed by financial compensation, and Rosalind felt relief rather than guilt because she knew with bone-deep certainty that she had saved them both from a pallid half-life of emotional emptiness. When the house had quieted and Charlotte had tactfully withdrawn and her parents had retired to discuss this latest dramatic development, Rosalind found the Duke waiting in the garden where so much of their tentative courtship had unfolded, and she walked to him through the late spring sunshine, feeling lighter than she had in years, and before he could speak she said simply, "Ask me properly, Your Grace, with no bargains or conditions or 6-week trials. Ask me as if we are simply two people who have found something precious and unexpected." He smiled then, that rare, unguarded expression that transformed his austere features into something approaching joy, and he took both her hands in his and said, "Miss Rosalind Pemberton, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, not because of my title or my wealth or any consideration beyond the simple fact that I love you more than I believed it possible to love anyone, and I wish to spend the remainder of my life learning how to deserve the gift of your regard?" She answered, "Yes," with tears streaming down her face, and they stood together in the garden discussing not wedding logistics but the shape of their future life. His promise to support her charitable work, not merely with funds, but with genuine partnership, her insistence on honesty and mutual respect as the foundation of their marriage, their shared vision of transforming his cold London residence into a home filled with warmth and purpose, and as the afternoon lengthened into golden evening, she acknowledged what her heart had known, perhaps longer than her mind would admit, that his patient transformation had earned what his aristocratic privilege never could have claimed, and that sometimes the deepest love grows not from perfect beginnings, but from the courage to become better than one was. 5 years passed like the turning of seasons, each one layering new growth over old scars, until the pain of those early years became something distant and almost dreamlike in its unreality. And in the autumn of 1828, the Duke and Duchess of Winterbourne stood together in the garden of their Somerset estate, watching their 3 children play among the roses that Rosalind had planted in the first year of their 24 marriage, their laughter bright as birdsong in the golden afternoon light. The estate that had once been her refuge in solitude had become something far richer, a true home filled with the warmth and joy that both she and Nicholas had believed impossible in those dark years before they found their way to each other, and the transformation was evident in every corner of the residence, from the nursery where their eldest daughter, Charlotte, named for Rosalind's sister, practiced her letters with fierce concentration, to the library where Nicholas still retreated with his wife for quiet conversations after the children were abed, to the village school that had expanded into a full charitable foundation supporting education and welfare throughout the county with the Duke's considerable resources and Rosalind's passionate dedication. London society, which had once whispered about the cold Duke of Winterbourne and his impossibly high standards, now spoke with wondering admiration about his devotion to his wife and family, about the way his austere features softened when the Duchess entered a room, about how the man who had once seemed carved from ice had proven capable of profound and patient love when he finally allowed himself to feel it. Rosalind sat on the garden bench where 5 years earlier she had broken her engagement to Mr. Wickford, and Nicholas settled beside her with their youngest child drowsing against his shoulder, and they watched their other 2 children chase each other through the paths where they had once conducted their tentative courtship, and she felt such profound gratitude for the circuitous journey that had brought them to this moment that tears pricked her eyes even as she smiled. Nicholas noticed, as he always did, and he took her free hand in his and said quietly, "Do you ever regret the pain it required to reach this peace?" And she shook her head and answered with complete honesty, "The pain taught us both who we needed to become, and I would not trade this reality for any easier path that might have led to a lesser love." They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon lengthened toward evening, and Rosalind reflected on how impossible this happiness would have seemed. To her 17-year-old self, weeping in a carriage after a ballroom humiliation, or to her 23-year-old self, hardened by repeated heartbreak, and she understood now what she could not have known then, that the deepest transformations require time and courage in equal measure, that love is not diminished by difficulty but rather refined by it, that the wrong person at the wrong time can become exactly right when both parties choose growth over comfort and truth over pretense. Dear listener, if you have followed this long and winding tale to its conclusion, perhaps you recognize something of your own journey in these pages, for we have all known rejection and heartbreak. We have all built walls to protect wounded hearts. We have all wondered whether true connection is possible or merely a beautiful fiction we tell ourselves to make loneliness bearable. But consider this: the most profound love stories are not those that unfold easily and without obstacle, but rather those that require both parties to become better versions of themselves, to shed the protective layers that keep others at a distance, to risk vulnerability even when past pain counsels caution. Nicholas and Rosalind's story teaches us that timing matters far less than transformation, that the courage to change is worth more than the comfort of remaining as we are, that patience and authenticity will always matter more than grand gestures performed without genuine feeling. If you find yourself waiting for love, use that time not merely to wait but to grow, to become someone capable of the depth of connection you desire, to heal the wounds that might otherwise poison future happiness. If you have known rejection, understand that sometimes what feels like an ending is merely a postponement until both parties are ready for what they could not have sustained before. And if you have built walls around your heart, know that the right person will have the patience to wait while you dismantle them brick by brick, and will help you rebuild not barriers, but foundations strong enough to support a love that can weather any storm. May you find the courage to become who you must be, to receive the love you deserve. May you grant others the grace to grow, even as you grow yourself, and may your own journey, however long and difficult, lead you finally to a garden full of laughter and light, where past pain becomes merely prologue to lasting peace.